Hi, welcome to It's Not the Same Without the Sand. This is a show that's dedicated to raising the level of awareness of the erosion of our coastlines. My name is Irene Davis and I'm your host. I am the president of the Trustees of Sandwich Beaches. And today we have two guests who are going to be helping us to understand the permitting process. We last time talked about the beach nourishment plan and project, and now we're going to talk about what it takes to get that done. So I have two guests today. I have Kirk Bosma from the Woods Hole Group and Bud Dunham, who is the Sandwich Town Manager. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
I'm going to just kind of step back for a minute and remind folks that back in November we had a special town meeting and we voted, and I believe it was almost unanimous, if not unanimous, to use $150,000 of our community preservation funds to help with the permitting process. We were told that it was going to take 15 to 18 months, and that made my heart stop when I heard that. And I think as I've learned a little bit more about that process, I think I understand it. And so I'd really like for the two of you to help our audience understand why it takes this long and what's involved. So, Bud, I'm going to let you go ahead and start.
Sure. Just to back up with what you said, Irene, that town meeting was generous enough, as was the Community Preservation Committee, to support giving the town $150,000 to help with our permitting efforts. And again, as we've talked previously, not only for the Old Harbor Inlet Stabilization Project, but also for a beach nourishment plan. And I think that was done in the beginning of November last year. And in order to get that request before the committee that reviews the CPA funding and before town meeting, Kirk, on behalf of Woods Hole Group, had given us a proposal on what the scope of work would be, so that's how we came up with that figure. I think it's important to note that since town meeting voted, we've had a couple of important meetings with some of our federal delegation and some state officials, and have gotten a little bit better understanding of how we maybe had to modify that scope of work compared to when we went to town meeting. So we have done that in the last 4 to 6 weeks, and so we are executing a contract with Woods Hole Group to sort of fulfill that two-pronged effort that we've talked about previously, the Old Harbor Inlet Stabilization and the Beach Nourishment Plan. And I think this is maybe where a lot of the engineering work comes into play, and a lot of sort of the homework that we have to do to come up with the best designs. When we submitted a draft environmental impact report to the state back in the 2005-2006 range, there was a ton of engineering work that went into that, and I think it's fair to say most of that was focused on the inlet stabilization project at Old Harbor. So this is not only fulfilling that and trying to come up with a redesign or a better design if we had to, or maybe the design that we had before is the right one, but we're going to have to prove that to the state and federal permitting agencies, but also to look at a beach nourishment plan, which is something it's probably fair to say that's easier to permit, it's a little bit easier to design because it's not as unique, and yet that's still something that we have to spend the time and money to do all that groundwork. Like you had said, in the best case scenario, we're probably looking at 15 to 18 months to get all the permits. And I think it's fair to say it's not like you're just getting a building permit for a house that you might complain when you have 3 or 4 permits to get. But something like this that involves so many different agencies at different levels, I mean, you're literally talking more than a dozen permits for each of the projects. And I think it's also important to realize that we may have to get certain projects from certain state agencies, and they might be very supportive, and then parts of the project may entail something that might be more environmentally sensitive, and we're going to have to get a permit from an agency that doesn't like to give permits or has a hard time, because their job is to protect endangered species. And so it would be, that's a big hurdle that we're going to have to get over, especially on the Old Harbor Inlet. So when you mention the breaches that have occurred over time, unfortunately, some of those washover areas and the breached areas are the primary places for habitat for those endangered shorebirds. And so that's a struggle. And I think we felt we were going along the right lines the last time we really submitted the permit and the design, where we were increasing the habitat for the plovers and the least terns substantially. Got some comments from them and actually went back and redesigned and created even more habitat. Now we have to see if that design that we had looked at 6 years ago, is it still valid for what we need to do now and in the future? So that's sort of the type of thing that we'll be looking at. And it's important to note that before we did all that, or while we were doing it, you know, we got support from a lot of different groups, federal agencies, state agencies, the Mass Audubon Society, you know, all those groups were supporting what we were doing, and it's just a fact of life that certain permits are harder to get than others.
I know that there are certain steps, and maybe Kirk and Bud, you can help step us through those. I know that one of the first things that we have to do is have an order of conditions submitted. Is that correct? Or does it need to be in that order?
Not really in that order.
Okay.
I mean, the good news is here, based on the appropriation that happened, was most of the engineering and science is already done. All right, so that was done on the Old Harbor project.
Right.
So we understand what the waves are doing. We understand how sand's moving. We understand the influence of the canal. We understand tidal currents and water quality and everything associated with the beach. We have most of the engineering done. As Bud mentioned, it's going to be a little bit refocused now on extending the beach nourishment along the entire stretch, so we can hopefully incorporate both a Old Harbor stabilization with a beach nourishment project. So the good news is the science and understanding and engineering is done. That brings us to the next step, which unfortunately is a difficult one, which is permitting. Engineering, although you may think all the science that goes into that is really tricky and tough, really the permitting can be the most arduous process. And I think the most important thing to understand is just how many you have to get and how many agencies you have to go through to get the permits in place to go and do this. I mean,
and some are predicated on others, right?
Yeah, so the reason why the timelines on these things extend so long is you have 7 or so permits you have to get. You can't even start the permitting process on some of them until you have a permit in hand from one of the previous ones. And then if any questions arise or anything, there's no real strict timeline on how long they may take to review it if they start to have questions or say they need feedback or you have to go through another round. So the place to start is with the Mass, MEPA is called, and you need to file.
What does that stand for?
Massachusetts Environmental Protection Agency.
Okay.
You basically have to file a environmental impact report, which was done for the Old Harbor project. That needs to be updated and refiled for the projects we're going to do now.
So the entire beach nourishment and the Old
entire beach
Harbor.
nourishment in the Old Harbor.
Right.
Then you get a certificate of approval from them, basically, that then will allow you to go get all the other permits that are required. So it starts at that level, and a lot of the agencies kind of comment through the MEPA to identify what their concerns are going to be going forward. That's where we were before. As Bud kind of mentioned, we ran into some issues on just specific permits.
So had we gotten through all of the permits except for maybe 1 or 2 at that point?
No, we were to the point where we were submitting to get the certificate. The town made the decision at that point to halt the process because we envisioned there was going to be a battle in front of us, and they didn't want to take on that battle at that time. So we stopped short of submitting, which is called the final EIR. We submitted a draft EIR, which was a significant document of all the engineering and design and coastal processes. Once you have that, you can then go get all the other permits, which are required from the Army Corps, the Coastal Zone Management, from DEP. You need a water quality permit. All these permits that you need, which we don't necessarily have to get into today, all have associated timelines with them. So there may be a 90-day review period, which is 3 months, right?
Yes.
And then after that, you have another 30-day public review comment.
Right.
And then you get a permit. Well, then you can only go maybe do the next permit.
Right. How long are these permits good for? So if this process gets extended, are they good for 2 years or?
They're typically good. I mean, they all vary, but
Yeah.
they usually are good for 10 years or if you can do the project within that 10-year time frame. And again, some of them vary, some of them have different timelines, and by no means am I an expert on all the different
I know permitting is not your
processes,
thing, yes.
But it's, I do know from having done the engineering and trying to work with our permitting team to get this stuff done that it can be a very difficult and long process. And unfortunately, anytime you have a barrier beach, which is a natural resource, and you have endangered species habitat on that beach, well, that just makes it that much harder.
Yeah.
I think it's important too to note that a lot of the work that we had done a decade ago and more recently is still valid today. So we might have to update things. Like we'll be doing some survey work is I think one of the first deliverables once I guess the weather's gotten a lot better lately, but that we can go out and start looking at some of that. But we'll have real data to compare it to, in the same survey type work that was done a decade ago. So I think that will be quite telling and should help with our story about why these are important.
One of the things that we talked about in a previous episode was where do we get the sand, and what are potential sand sources? And there are numerous. You might want to talk about some of those, but certainly if we're talking about offshore sources, does that require permitting, and what's that process like?
Yeah, so we talked about the engineering and the design, and that a beach nourishment is a designed project. It has a certain lifetime associated with it. It's not going to last forever, but if it's done right, it can be economically viable and a very good thing to protect the town. Then you have to go through the permitting process, and we're talking about that a little bit now. The next step is, okay, if you get those things, you have an engineered beach, you say, okay, great, and we have the permits, we can go do this, wonderful. You still need sand placed on the beach to make it happen if beach nourishment is a big component of it, which it would be since this is a pretty sediment-starved situation. So sources of sand, it could be from a lot of different places. The key thing is to keep the options open. Offshore sediment source for some level of quantity or a significant level of quantity that would likely be required here is a key thing.
What do you think in terms of what would be required, just to give our audience a sense?
Oh, yeah, this is, if we're talking about both the Old Harbor project and the beach nourishment, we're talking hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of material. Now, to put that in some perspective, I mean, when you talk about New Jersey or Florida, their nourishments, there's millions of cubic yards of material. Okay, so this, depending on what kind of scale you're talking about, it's small or big.
Yeah.
For Massachusetts, it's a relatively big project. The one we just completed out in Martha's Vineyard was order of 100,000 cubic yards. We're probably 400,000 cubic yards at this location. But compared to Florida or New Jersey, 4 million, so order of magnitude bigger. But yeah, I mean, the Cape Cod Canal is obviously a source. Do they have enough? No, but it's a great navigational project that is cheaper sand, easier to permit. It's a beneficial reuse. It's much more important than to get it on the beach than dump it offshore, which has been kind of the historical way of doing things because it's the cheapest way of doing things. But if you just think about it, I mean, that's sand that normally would have been coming to these beaches, right? Instead, it just falls into the canal or makes its way into the canal. They take that and dump it offshore. Again, thinking of, if you had a valuable coal mine, would you take half your coal and just throw it away? I mean, that's the same idea, right?
Yeah.
So, but to supplement that, since it's been, close to a century now or more that canal's been in place and sediment hasn't been coming over to the side, you're going to need more than just what happened over the last 10 years or so of building up sediment in the canal. So that's where an offshore source would come in, whether it's offshore Scusset Beach somewhere off in Cape Cod Bay. I think it's important that needs to be in the mix.
And sometimes I think people don't understand that it has to be the right sand. We can't just take any sand and put it on this beach. Maybe you could speak to that just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's, so getting permits to take the sand from an offshore is another whole process that needs to happen. Whether it's from the canal or an offshore borrow site or an upland source even, it has to be compatible with the beach. You certainly wouldn't want to put rocks on something that isn't going to necessarily be work. Now, it would function well, right? It would be harder to road, but that's not a beach. You wouldn't want to put down real fine clay material either. It would be gone very quickly. It's not a beach either. So it's got to be compatible. And from an offshore standpoint, that material has to be compatible with the beach, and it also has to be from an area that isn't serving a significant environmental benefit to the offshore fisheries industry, benthic community. So there's studies and evaluations that have to go on to identify where your sand is coming from.
Yeah.
And I think that's, like as Kirk was mentioning, just in terms of some of the sand issues, it's important to note that any of the sand that we've used on the beaches in the past and on the dunes has come from the canal, just from different dredging projects. But those don't happen, that frequently in the scheme of things. Maybe once a decade or once every 7 years.
Maybe good for maintenance. Maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the volumes that you get, even the largest, I believe, dredging that occurred in the canal in the recent years, was probably only not even half of what the volume that we needed, you know, for the whole different 2 projects that we've talked about. So one of the things that we've included in our contract is to try to look at some stopgap measures too. And I know our Natural Resources Director, Mark Galkowski, has met with the county dredge people to see, as sand has come into the old harbor, is there some of the sand that's filled in there that could be, you know, on more short-term, easier permit, be able to pumped over. So we are looking not only just at the longer 2 things with the 2 projects that we often refer to, but we're looking at some stopgap measures too, if there's any smaller things we could do to help out.
Yeah, we talked about that county dredge in a previous show, and that's something that we pay for, we contribute to, correct?
Yeah.
And so we would have access to that. Was that free of charge?
It's, I think it depends on the size of the project and how it goes. So because we don't have any projects that have met their criteria in Sandwich, I'm not as familiar as maybe some of the towns, you know, in Dennis, I know Harwich have used them several times, but they don't, the size of their dredge certainly could not do the Cape Cod Canal, so we haven't had to, you know, take advantage of their services.
Yeah.
I mean, the key thing here, as part of what the project is, you know, Bud just mentioned the stopgap measures. So
right.
the town's really thinking about sustainability here and long-term
right,
sustainability. Yeah. So there's the short-term piece where we're going to try to implement, you know, lower cost local options to provide, you know, a supplemental source of sediment to the beach. Then there's the big project that we're talking about now, which is the beach nourishment, which is an important component of it. And then finally, there's the maintenance, which you mentioned. And once that, if you think about when the canal went in a century ago, right, this town has basically lost a century of sediment coming into the system. So if you could get that back, right, and get it back to where you were, make up for that century, which is what this kind of project is geared to do, then potentially you could use the decade-based dredgings from the Cape Cod Canal to maintain it.
Right.
And it would almost be like a more of a natural, naturally but man-influenced bypassing of sediment onto the beach to hopefully maintain that consistency and that sustainability of the barrier beach system. And that's really the ultimate goal here of the whole project. Now there's all these pit holes and permitting obstacles that you have to go through, but it's a good plan in essence. Is to
and you
do
have
that.
to have a plan. You got to start there, right? If you don't have a plan, where are you? So,
and I think hopefully we can try to get some hope from some of those other states who've been successful. But I know one of the things that Kirk's taught me over time is that, you know, some of those states have, you know, already approved offshore borrow sites, and for whatever reason, Massachusetts hasn't allowed that. So, I mean, we would really be, you know, recreating the wheel by doing it. There was recently an effort on the part of the Cape Cod Commission to develop and approve an ocean management plan.
Yep.
And I know one of the selectmen, Jim Pierce, was very active in attending and tried to get them to see that one offshore borrow site that we've identified that's quite a ways out from the mouth of the canal that could bear some potential. Not that that's the only thing that we'd look at, but I think, you know, they were careful in trying to help work with us on what we could do. But that's an issue that's probably much, much bigger than just the town of Sandwich when you factor in, you know, a state approving offshore borrow sites. So.
It's frustrating. So I came from Delaware. I know you were in Delaware. I see the replenishment programs that go on in so many other states. Florida, obviously, they've got, it's their industry, the tourist industry. It's very, very big, and there's a very strong motivation for that. But it's very frustrating when you see it happening all around you, and we just seem to hit so many roadblocks.
The state of New Jersey is a perfect example that does it as part of their operating procedure, and the state works with the federal government there to maintain authorized shore protection projects. Woods Hole Group is working with the Army Corps and the state down in New Jersey now to basically implement more cost-saving ways to manage their sediment, because sediment and sand is becoming a pretty valuable resource nowadays.
Yeah, I bet.
So, you know, it's frustrating sometimes that when you look at other states and they've kind of, you know, figured it out to a certain extent. And Massachusetts has its own concerns, and, you know, fisheries is a big part of it. But eventually something's going to have to happen. We've been working with the Cape Cod Commission as well on that in the state. I mean, people probably know about the Winthrop Beach project and some of the tribulations they went through to get an offshore borrow site, which hasn't happened yet. But eventually I think there's going to have to be a case where, you know, sediment is taken from offshore, used for beach nourishment, to see what the impacts really are. We just don't know in this area well enough, and there needs to be that first try, and it's a tough thing to think about doing, but eventually I think it will have to.
It's frustrating when you know that there's a source of sand out there and you know the difficulties that are involved in it. It's not as simple as, okay, we've got a source of sand out there. It's probably our sand. It came down from, from the White Cliffs of Plymouth, most likely, and yet we can't just go and get it. I mean, it's going to be a very long process. It's going to take permitting and those kinds of things if we were to go to that source. I understand there's other sources as well, but from a lay public standpoint, you go, it's right there. Why can't we get it?
And
it's not that simple.
I think to a person, we've gotten the right people aware of our project, supportive of the project and what we need to do. And if you just run down the list, Representative Keating has been very supportive and has given a lot of staff time towards helping us. We've sent letters and at different times met once with Senator Brown, and we've sent a number of different documents to Senator Kerry. And most importantly, I would say at the state level, we have the fortune of having, Senate President Murray as our state senator, and she actually personally came down to tour the area and to get an overview last summer with the head of the Department of Environmental Protection, the head of Executive Office of Environmental Affairs. So those are three of the highest levels people, right. And probably most importantly, our own state rep, Randy Hunt, has been a champion of this effort for a long time. And as you know, Irene, he and Paul Schrader have actually done a really professional video outlining sort of the history of what we've done and sort of show. And we look back on that, and that's probably now a couple years old, and yet, so he's intimately aware of it more than anyone else even. And so, anyone that we possibly could to bring this to their attention and to get on our side, I think that's there. And it's sort of like you have to pick the right time to rattle the cages, and I think we all feel that time's coming pretty soon.
Yeah, and just for our audience, that video is called Sands of Change, is that right?
That's right.
And you can find it on YouTube, and I think the 10-minute version might be the one that's on YouTube, but I think it's very educational to see what's happened to our beaches and our coastline. You guys both mentioned Chatham at one time or another, and I know that Chatham actually has a position in their town that's a coastal resource manager. I think his name is Ted Keon, if I'm correct. It almost seems like, Bud, everyone knows how stretched you are, and you've got many other issues than just this beach issue. And so it just seems like it would be helpful if we had somebody that would be championing, and that was their job, because I think this is a very critical issue for the town, or somebody that could be shared, maybe with the Cape Cod Commission and some of the other towns. This is not just our problem. Is there any talk about trying to get someone like that in place?
Yeah, we haven't had the funding to do like a separate position like that. Like obviously our Natural Resource Office has been, sort of spearheading the effort and knows the most about, the effort, working most closely with Kirk. Yeah, so we haven't had a separate position for that.
But I just wonder if there could be someone that might be shared by the towns, and if everyone made a contribution. And their job, again, the Natural Resources Department, they're stretched as well.
And
everybody's stretched, and to me, it's an important enough issue that someone from our town, I know you're on it, and I know we have Woods Hole Group people, but someone from our town, it should be their job. It would be nice if we could somehow come to that point, because I think Chatham obviously has got a lot of problems, and they decided to make a position for someone that takes care of that. And I think that they're doing a fairly good job. You probably know more about that than I do. They still have a lot of problems, obviously, but I don't know. I think that there's been a lot of talk among our group as to having somebody that it's their job, and that's all they work on. And they can kind of deliver the message. They can do a lot of the work that a number of people in our town are trying to do, but just get stretched so thin.
No, it is true, and the selectmen realize the importance. It's one of the primary things on their list of long-range plan, is the whole Old Harbor issue and the beach management plan. And one of the things that we've talked about too is if you look at that and how it's listed on the long-range plan, it has the technical end that myself and Kirk and Mark Galkowski and others will be working on, but then it also has the political end, and that's a task that they've assigned for themselves as one of their priorities, and not that they haven't been working on it for a long time, but I think it's fair to say last winter we had a discussion with the board about what are the 5 largest capital needs for the town. Number 1 was the school roofs and windows because of the timing of that. That's underway. Number 2 was the joint public safety building, which, as the public probably knows, that idea has been floated, and it has a ways to go yet, but we're working on that. Number 3 was a road bond issue that, you know, our DPW director every year goes through with the selectmen and the finance committee, and everyone understands the support for it, but the problem is coming up with the money. And then, you know, right there along with it was the, you know, the whole beach erosion issue and what we can do. So it's telling that it's that high up on the list because, like you said, there's dozens of things that myself and a lot of other town staff spend a lot of time on that are below that, and yet it's still right up at the top, so that's important to remember.
Yeah. One of the questions that I get asked about, and this might be directed at you, Kirk, is, and I don't know if this deals with permitting or the plan, the nourishment plan, but the groins. So I hear, you know, groins are good, because they seem to capture the sand in between the groins, and you can see that sculpting that goes on. And then I hear that groins are bad, and that groins actually stop the natural flow down the coastline. I'm wondering if that's something that we're going to be, I don't know if you have come up with that decision yet at this point, or what your thoughts are about these groins.
Yeah, groins can be good or bad, I guess, depending on your viewpoint, right? Depending on where you live sometimes. If you're on the updrift side, meaning the side where the sand's coming from, it's going to stop sand, keep it on in front of your home. If you're on the downdrift side, that sand isn't going to make its way down there. So generally speaking, from the state's viewpoint and regulatory viewpoint, groins are generally determined to be bad because they're not allowing kind of the natural flow of sediment along the beach. The jetty at the canal is, in a sense, a type of groin, right? So we can all kind of agree that hasn't had a very positive impact on the town of Sandwich. Now, it has had a positive impact on the shoaling in the canal, reducing the dredge requirements of the canal and a federal cost there. So the groins are looked at in the previous report, and I should mention that report is fully available at the public library in the town. You can go look at the draft environmental impact report. There's a lot of technical stuff in there, but there's a lot of good stuff that people can understand and get through there. So in the current project, I think there was removal of some key groins that don't seem to be really having significant function, where other ones were left in place to have function. Part of the problem with the groins of Sandwich is that they put back in the 1950s, 1960s timeframe. There was still some sediment in the system. Now there just isn't much. So they don't really have too big of an influence right now because there's not a lot of natural sand moving through the system. It'd be nice to see how they actually would perform, what their function would be if you did start to recharge the beach with some sediment.
Yeah, so the plan is to probably leave some of them in, it sounds like?
The current plan would be to leave some of them, remove some of them. That was the old harbor plan. For the beach nourishment plan, it would probably be to just leave them all in.
Leave them there, yeah. So just want to finish up. So our permitting process is somewhere between 15 and 18 months. When does that start? Is that starting once?
Yeah, some of the engineering and data gathering, you know, that's already started. So that's the type of thing, you know, and then once we get to the point where we have the right information to be able to apply for the permits, then that sort of gets that ball rolling.
Is that when the clock starts, or is the clock already started, do you think?
Well, I can tell you that we just got through the whole contracting process now. So like last week, we got the formal contract. So
we're thinking, I'm just thinking about how many more winters we have to get through,
the clock is starting primarily now.
Okay.
So we're going forward with, the first thing that's going to happen is a really detailed survey of the beach, which is, you know, important. Got to understand, and it's a key piece because we had a survey probably about 10 years ago. So we'll be able to really see on a regional basis what has changed out there, which is a great demonstration to, you know, the politics side of things to show, look, here's what's happened just in the contemporary time frame. So that you should be seeing surveyors out there within the next month or so. And then we'll have some engineering work. But yeah, the clock on the 18-month window is starting now. I would say ultimately that's dictated by the regulatory agencies.
Understood.
And once we submit permits, we don't know how long they may take, or how many comments they might have, or how many iterations things have to go through. But the contract's in place, and we're pushing forward right now.
I guess that's all we have time for. I want to thank you guys. This was extremely helpful. I think it's very helpful for the public to understand the magnitude of this process. I think it's much bigger than any of us as lay public really understand. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it. That's it for our show, and thank you.